welcome to yet another episode of Making Money, a podcast that focuses on, enlightening you about how you can make money. Money is a very important aspect in our life because it's partly one of the reasons why we wake up every early morning to go to work looking for money. Probably you're in business and you're doing everything left, right, and center to be able to make ends meet. And money is a critical aspect in that particular regard. In this particular episode, we are looking at climate change and business. And with me on set today is Mr. Robert Turiachira. Yes. Mr. Robert Turiachira is a lawyer and an environmentalist. Welcome to this particular episode of the podcast. It's a pleasure having you, Mr. Turiachira.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ken. I'm very glad to be part of this podcast. As you introduced me, my name is Robert Turiachira. I'm the Executive Director of the African Greenhouse Network and a climate activist, but also the environmental rights defender. I'm glad to be part of this conversation, especially underpinning the nexus between climate change and business. And
it's a pleasure having you.
Shall be talking about what are the challenges, what are the effects, but also what are the remedies of, as far as climate change is concerned.
Thank you so much. And let's begin by understanding what climate change is, even before we draw the link between it and the business.
Well, first of all, what we need to first understand is that climate change is a very big, problem, very big threat globally. We're talking about the triple planetary crisis, as some of you, the viewers, have been following the conversations both at the global level but also at the national level, where we see that we talk about issues of climate change, biodiversity loss, but also pollution, where the most vulnerable in our communities are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change. And indeed, at the global level, the conversation has been, how do we urgently combat this problem? Because if you're talking about the issue of sustainable development, then it means we cannot achieve this agenda unless we focus on environmental sustainability. And at the core of that is the issue of combating climate change. Indeed, there's been global efforts, whether it is at the institutional level, whether it's at the global legal and policy framework. For example, talking about the Paris Agreement, to try and make the global community come together to try and see that we combat climate change, because the critical issue that we all must appreciate, and as we have all witnessed in our communities, that the most vulnerable are the ones who are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change. Because most of our people, especially those in the agriculture sector, in the informal sector, those who are doing small and medium enterprises, small businesses, people who are involved in livestock farming, the people that you can say that they are on the end of the value chain as far as survival and livelihoods are concerned. These are the people who are affected by issues of climate change. And we see that communities continue to grapple with this big problem. And of course, where we have a big problem is that we have, for example, issues that are like now, for example, deforestation, where there is a lot of cutting down of trees. The latest report shows that we lose over 10 to 12 million hectares of forest cover globally because of effects of deforestation. And because of that, we have seen increase in global warming, as the effects of increase in greenhouse gas emissions. But also we see encroachment on fragile ecosystems, where most of the people, for example, settle in wetlands. Like in Uganda, it's widespread, where you see the most vulnerable in our communities try to struggle to find survival, and therefore they end up settling in some of these wetlands. But of course, we see also businesses that set up in the wetlands, like we see largely like here in Kampala, where some of the businesses they are set up in the like industries, factories, they're set up in the wetlands. So the conversation about the effects of climate change must be twofold. First of all, to understand the problem that we are facing, the elephant in the room. How did we reach the level where we are right now, that we are talking about an existential threat, where climate change is not only just affecting humanity, but it's also affecting the entire biodiversity.
All right.
And that is what, as a global community, we're trying to see that we can actually jointly combat, whether it's working with the government, whether it's working with civil society, whether it's about working with the private sector, and of course also citizens, especially leveraging on the power of young people to see that we can actually jointly combat this problem of climate change, which is an existential threat.
And you raise a very important issue then. I will ask, how did we get there in the context of Uganda? There's a global perspective, but there's also a localized perspective. As a country, how did we get where we are in terms of climate change?
Well, of course, we must appreciate that the issue that we are talking about, first of all, in the Ugandan perspective, because Uganda is not an island, it's part of as you said, it's part of the global community, it's part of the African or even East African, region, where we actually see that, number one, you see, because, climate scientists have been very categorical about what is the cause of climate change. And one of them is where there are natural forces, which have actually been progressively, causing climate change. But also we have what we call the human-induced, activities that actually also result the effects of climate change. In fact, the climate scientists call them anthropogenic forces. That the activities that we undertake as a people, first of all for livelihoods, but also for the economy, for economic survival, is actually what causes the problem of climate change. So, and of course, that really just worsens an already bad situation. So, in the Ugandan perspective, as I said, you have a problem of deforestation. That you have about 75% of Uganda's population, driving their livelihood and of course, biomass energy, surviving on biomass energy, charcoal and firewood. Most of the population in our homes, in the schools, in hospitals, in the prisons, across the energy mix. You have over 75% of the population using charcoal and firewood. And that causes a lot of deforestation because by about 1990, we had about 24% of the forest cover. But that has been going down tremendously. That right now, we have about 12% of the forest cover. That has been a problem because one thing that the viewer must appreciate is that forests are carbon sinks. Once they are cut down, then you have a disruption in what you call the water cycle, but also the absorption, the capacity of the environment to absorb the greenhouse gas emissions, and that is the biggest problem. That are, as I also said, the settling of of people in fragile ecosystems also disrupts the water cycle, and therefore you have a problem where these ecologically fragile ecosystems, which are supposed to help in maintaining environmental sustainability, they actually severely disrupted. And Uganda's situation has been very, very detrimental because we all see in the communities where, for example, you have these climate-related disasters. In fact, Uganda, right now, you could say that it has turned into more or less like a disaster hotspot. You see time and again, people being washed down, especially the most vulnerable in our communities, the poor, the people with disabilities, the women, the children who are actually being victims of climate change. That you see areas like, for example, like Rwenzori sub-region, where you see, usually, for example, when it rains, you see that the River Nyamwamba bursting the banks and washing down the houses of the people. Going to the Elgon sub-region, where you see, for example, numerous and periodic landslides and mudslides, the people get washed down. People's crops, the houses are washed down. So we have a big problem, and indeed, there has been some progressive efforts as a country, where you see that, for example, from an institutional framework where the Ministry of Water and Environment even had to promote the climate change unit to a climate change department to try and aggregate efforts by government to try and see that we actually can build the capacity as a country to try and combat climate change. But also at the legal framework level, you've seen, for example, the coming into force of the climate change policy of 2015 and also the enactment of the Climate Change Act of 2021 to try and see that we buttress some of these efforts, because even at parliament level, we had even to establish through the Parliamentary Forum on Climate Change to establish a climate change committee that is currently headed by the Honorable Songa Lawrence to try and see that we don't only just talk about this problem, but we as a country work together towards how we can, solve this problem. And of course, whether we've achieved, our ambitions as a country is a story for another day, because you see, we have a climate action plan that lays out, ambitious, interventions by government to try and see how we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Because as I said in the preamble, climate scientists, the latest report from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, shows that the number one cause of climate change is actually the increase in greenhouse gas emissions as the effects of burning of fossil fuels. Now, government's intervention is that we should be able, as a country, to try and see that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to a tune of 24.7% by the year 2030. And government has disaggregated interventions, especially through the energy sector, as I told you, transitioning from biomass energy to clean energy resources, but also the issue of the Aforo arrangement, where you are promoting agroforestry, promoting land use management, and also agriculture as a hanging fruit.
There's also e-vehicles.
Absolutely, because when you talk about greenhouse gas emissions, you see like in Uganda we import most of second-hand cars, used cars, which actually really emit a lot of fumes, and that has also caused a big problem because not only just from an environmental perspective, but also from an environmental health and respiratory complications, where the air quality, for example, like Uganda and Kampala in particular, we have one of the worst air qualities in the whole world. Indeed. So we must be able to look at the issues of environment and climate change, not just from an environmental perspective, but must look at them from the issue of economic perspectives, how the climate change is actually affecting the economy, because our economy is largely agrarian, it's basically land-based, agriculture-based. Then also talk about how it affects the infrastructure, right. How the climate change affects the washing down the roads, the bridges, and that is a very big problem.
All right. And now let's go to that discussion on how climate change actually affects business. You say our country is largely agrarian, meaning that most of our livelihoods are connected to agriculture. And in there's a problem. Are there any particular indicators that you can share where indeed climate change has already caused us problems in terms of agriculture or in terms of any other businesses that you can connect to climate change? Are we making any losses or we're making gains? We shall look at the other side also, because behind every cloud, dark cloud is what they call the silver lining. Can we also make money through climate change?
Well, first of all, our viewer must appreciate that, yes, while it is very important that we must be able to appreciate, as I said, we must be able to, underpin, the real glaring challenges of climate change, especially at the community level. We must also flip the coin and be able to see, as you said, for every problem there's an opportunity, there's a solution, and how do we
let's first
make
look at
business
the negative impact?
Yes,
before we look at the other opportunity.
Yeah,
the impact on the business. How is climate change affecting business?
First of all, looking at the agriculture sector, as I said, agriculture is a victim of climate change, but also climate scientists have shown us that it is also a contributor to climate change, because if you're actually talking about land reclamation, the deforestation, where people are cutting down trees to actually reclaim land for agriculture, when they're talking about emissions that is actually undertaken, for example, in a dairy sector, where there's a lot of emissions for example, methane. It's a big area. But also you must understand that over 67% of the population, Uganda's population is in agriculture, is practicing what you call subsistence farming, where they only depend on rainfall, depend on nature, to thrive, and that. Why it is a big problem is that now agriculture becomes a very big victim. That once you are only just relying on nature, then it means that any slight change in the weather patterns, and it has a far-reaching effect, especially where we see, for example, whenever there are actually long droughts, the crops dry up, the livestock die off, and it causes a very big disruption, especially in issues of food security, in issues of how communities, because right now when you look at, for example, latest report from UBOS shows that Uganda has about 10.5 million households, and about 3.5 million households, they are actually outside the money economy, and as I said, climate change disproportionately affects now these most vulnerable communities, the households. So the issue of a dependency of agriculture on environment and
rain-fed
rainfall,
agriculture.
yes, it becomes a big problem, and that is why you must understand that if you're going to really solve that problem, then there must be deliberate intention to try and see that we actually promote climate smart agriculture, promote irrigation, that you can actually be able to carry out your agriculture even when it is actually dry. Dry, you can still grow your crops. But also you must understand, when you see, for example, like the flooding, most of the flood prone areas, usually there's what we call a hard pan that is created. That once the floods have actually happened in an area, and when it dries, now the soil becomes less fertile. It becomes very, very hard, and it's very hard to till. And there has been a significant decline in crop yields, in the communities. And that, as I said, also leads to, first of all, a reduction in how much can be got out of that area, and that affects the economy, but also the food security levels, that you actually have a situation where most of the families can no longer even afford to feed their families because of the low crop yields. And
we've also heard about pests and diseases as a result of climate change.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest problems farmers are contending with.
And that it's a double barrel. It's a double barreled gun because you find that even farmers try to use even pesticides and herbicides to try and even spray, and that also further worsens the environmental sector, because it affects the biodiversity, it kills the earthworms. So it is very, very, very true that the agriculture sector is especially like in the Ugandan perspective, where you find that there has not been deliberate effort. Because look at, for example, what government has tried to do, especially to try and promote the parish development model. Some of us, the environmental defenders, climate activists, we've been writing government, especially within civil society. We've been writing government to try and undertake what we call the integrated approach, where you find that, yes, although you provide the seedlings, although you provide the money, the 1 million that is being provided for every household and at a parish level, we must ensure that we integrate climate smart agriculture, promote climate smart solutions, to see that the communities are actually climate resilient. You must be deliberate about that. So for me, I think that as a person that has really been quite active, especially on the front line, to try and see that we, rally, our government to try and intentionally, especially the local leaders, because time and again, we must also understand that as I said, where there are these national efforts, the real, area where there is, the problem is on the ground in the communities, and that's you can call it where the rubber meets the tarmac. the people that actually are on the receiving end of climate-related disasters, actually the people in the community. Right. And that's why the interventions must be at the community level. But also, allow me to talk about the small businesses.
I want to, okay.
Yes, the small businesses are also very vulnerable because, as I said, the agricultural sector, when you talk about the transition that our agriculture sector has been taking over the years, is that you're trying to see that you have a bit of growing crops for food, for foodstuffs, but also the surplus for sale. And therefore, once you actually have low supply of the agricultural products on the market, then that also disrupts the entire agriculture economy. But also the small businesses that actually largely, whether you talk about a woman that is selling mangoes on the street, whether you talk about a woman that is our mothers who are selling maize on the roadside, selling gonjas, these ordinary informal people, they also get so much disrupted by the effects. You've seen, for example, like in Kampala, recently we saw when there was a heavy downpour, where people's shops were flooded by a lot of
all those are small businesses.
All those are small businesses, and therefore, as I said, the climate change is not just only an environmental issue, but it goes at the heart of our very own existence.
All right.
Disrupting the economy, especially the small business economy, disrupting livelihoods of the people, but also the very existence. Because, as I said, when you see, for example, such floods in people's shops and people's houses, you can be very sure that the likelihood of breaking up of environmental health hazards is very prevalent. I was reading a report, the latest report from the Ministry of Health. It shows that over 60%, of our disease burden is actually as a result of poor health and sanitation, as a result of environmental health hazards. Because you see diseases like, for example, cholera, bilharzia, all these that are related to poor sanitation is very critical. So therefore, we must be able to look at it from a 360 angle that climate change does not only, come from an environmental perspective, but how does it, cut across all these other key sectors of the economy? Even when you look at, for example, government intervention, like recently the government launched the tenfold growth strategy to try and, grow the current, 50 billion US dollars to 500 billion US dollars by 2040. But you see, without coming up with a robust, climate change intervention, beyond just the paperwork, we must be able to know that the biggest threat to our economic progress and economic growth as a country, climate change remains a very, very big change. And therefore, we must be intentional as a country to ensure that we come up with very clear, strategic, tailor-made solutions on how we are going to combat climate change.
All right, let's now flip the coin. Like I said, behind every dark cloud, there's a silver lining. Can we make money out of the climate change? We agree is a dark something there affecting us, but there are also opportunities around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, actually, in light of what you are saying, at the global level, you've been probably following the conversations on COP. We had the recent COP in Brazil, the COP for the viewers, the Conference of Parties, which is a global climate summit that takes place every year. Indeed, way back from 1995, when we had the first COP in Berlin, Germany, we have had so far 30 COPs where we have been, as a global community coming together, trying to come up with, how we can really, as a global community, come up with solutions to combat climate change. And indeed, there has been there has been a paradigm shift on how we can harness, the challenges that come with climate change, especially on how we can look for the opportunities. Recently, in July last year, there was a speech delivered by the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, where he was talking about climate change as a moment of opportunity, how the global community can actually harness, be able to leverage the challenge of climate change and be able to create opportunities, especially for our young people. And indeed, there's been conversations about, for example, related, to, for example, green innovations, how we can support, interventions and innovations by our young people on how we can actually provide solutions, climate smart solutions to the problem of climate change. Of course, also there has been incentives within the global spectrum. There has been incentives on through the framework. For example, the Paris Agreement, as I told you, the Paris Agreement was entered into in 2015 by over 193 countries of the UN, and our commitment therein was that all of us as a global community, we must be able to come up under the doctrine of the common but differentiated responsibilities on how we can actually combat climate change by making our voluntary commitments under the NDC framework, the national determined contributions. Now, under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, we came up with an incentive on the carbon trade and carbon markets as an incentive to try and support, agroforestry globally. Because when you look at, for example, the global architecture of the forest cover, as I said, we lose about 10 to 12 million hectares, but over 100 million hectares of global land is actually degraded. You must understand, dear viewers, that about 25% of the global surface is covered by land, and land is not increasing in size, but people are increasing. There are now about 8 billion people. So the more you have population increasing, the more we add more pressure on the environmental resources and in the land, and we have increased degradation. So therefore, the paradigm shift from land-based investments and land-based businesses to come up with the green transition. When, for example, you look at most of the innovations that, for example, like within the carbon trade mechanism, is to try to support those people who are coming up with agroforestry. Because, yes, although we are really, really seriously losing our natural forests, like, we see like in Uganda, Bugoma Forest, Mabera Forest, and all these forests that we are losing, there has been an intervention, both at the national level, but also through global efforts to try and see that we promote agroforestry, where many people can actually plant, forests, plantation of forests, and be able to protect the environment, but at the same time, be able to benefit, commercially from the forest through what you call the carbon units. And indeed, under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, there has been a domestication domestication of these legislations. For example, like in Uganda, we even recently gazetted the carbon trade regulations to try and capacitate the growing of a viable carbon trade industry, that if Kenneth, they actually find that you have your 10 acres of the forest cover, they can actually come and measure how much carbon dioxide you are sequestering from the atmosphere, absorbing from the atmosphere, and you can actually be paid for that as you maintain your forest, but you are actually continuously earning from your forest. So we think that such kind of interventions and incentives can actually go a long way to create an opportunity to see that we actually deliberately restore our forest cover.
And there's a chain also, I think. Even those who are involved in growing seedlings also benefit from that, because the more forests we plant, the more seedlings are required.
Absolutely.
And therefore, it also helps to increase, incomes to those who are involved in, setting up beds. Nursery beds for seedlings. So we've had carbon trade is one of the opportunities where we can make money. What else?
Yeah, but also talking about the seedlings, there has been also in the deliberate because our dear viewer must be helped to understand that even as you talk about the nursery beds, we must also be clear about some of the species, the tree species that must be planted, because of our robust campaign towards agroforestry, we have seen many people going for example, trees like pine, like eucalyptus trees, which actually further even affect the environment. So the process of laying out the nursery beds, our viewers must understand that we are deliberately promoting, as climate activists, but also, at the global level, we want to see that we restore the endangered indigenous trees. For example, in Uganda, we have the Mutuba trees, we have the Mwafu, we have the Musizi, all these indigenous trees, which are, for them, they are climate resilient, and they actually do not, affect the environment. But when, for example, plant eucalyptus trees, they further absorb water from the environment. And then you find that there's a problem. Like now we see, like for pine, they are highly flammable. You have been hearing about wildfires, for example, happening in California and other places. So some of these tree species that are highly flammable and have a big effect on the environment, we discourage them. We would like to encourage Ugandans to be able to, plant and restore, the indigenous tree species. You probably followed our case, the case where we sued the Jinja City Council, where a Chinese company wanted to cut down the Mivule trees in Jinja that were planted by the Great Semenka Kuguru. So there must be deliberate effort to try and restore and preserve and conserve our indigenous tree species. Not only that, but also the other point that you raised, I talked about. Right now, there are two groups of young people. First of all, the needs, they're not in employment, not in tertiary institutions, constitute now around 41%. Those are largely those in the informal sector. We're talking about the Batimbeyi, the people largely in the informal sector. And then most of these are really very, very young people, most of them in the ages of 17, 18, less than 25 years. But also you have high unemployment rates. So what we have also been encouraging is that government, as in a quest to try and create employment for our young people, government must be deliberate in creating green jobs. Because you see, the transition, if you're talking about a green taxonomy, of the green economy, how we can actually be able to grow a green economy, we must be able to see that you promote businesses and companies and investments, green investments that create business that either absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or reduce the emission of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So those are what we call the green businesses.
Green jobs.
Yes, to create green jobs for our young people. Because globally, there has been, when you see the statistics, the rate at which green jobs are actually being created is actually on an increase.
And I wanted to ask you whether there are also other opportunities when it comes to energy transition, moving away from fossil fuel to green energy, basically.
I was coming, when you look at, for example, the carbon trade that I was talking about, there are two types of business that they focus on. The business that absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but also the business that avoids
Use of
emitting,
fossil,
carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And therefore, if we have businesses that are focusing on green, on what we call green energy or clean renewable energy sources, like solar power, like clean cooking stoves, those are also supported. And indeed, as I told you, that according
there's also money there.
there's a lot of money there. There are many opportunities there. As I told you, climate scientists have been very clear that the number one cause of climate change is the burning of fossil fuels. And indeed, the latest study shows that, when these greenhouse gases are burnt, they actually create a blanket on the Earth's surface from a scientific angle, which actually traps the heat from escaping into the atmosphere. Remember that at the global level, our focus is that by 2050, we should be able to achieve carbon neutrality and be able to maintain 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the pre-industrial temperature. And for us to achieve that, there must be, and there has been this pushback, especially within the global spaces, the global north versus the global south, on the issue of either phasing out fossil fuels or phasing down. And of course the countries in the global south, especially like Uganda, there's been saying that for us we have to move gradually towards phasing down. But the countries in the global north, the latest report from the International Energy Agency shows that we should be able to stop any further exploitation of the fossil fuels. But of course, there's been also some bit of contestation on whether that is actually achievable or is not achievable. Because when you look at, for example, like in Uganda, like LPG, the liquefied petroleum gas, you have only about 0.8% of Ugandans who can actually, can be able to use gas. I don't know in your home whether you use charcoal or firewood, but probably you use gas. So many of our people, because the concept of affordability is very critical. Therefore, as we discuss about the need for the energy transition, the shift towards renewable and clean energy sources, the concept of affordability is very critical. And therefore, we must be able to see that we support and incentivize to have many young people go into supporting clean cooking, energy efficiency, so that we actually have a very big pool of jobs within that area. And we would want to see businesses that go into that area. And as I said, they are captured within the carbon trade mechanism.
All right, as we come towards the end of this discussion, I want to draw you to a very important project in our country, which is the project where we are trying to make vehicles that rely on electricity as a strategy to combat climate change. We are also seeing an increase in e-motorcycles. There are also vehicles coming up. But some people have been actually saying it's not sustainable. We are looking at the side of business. As a country, we are investing billions of taxpayers' money in it. From your perspective as an environmentalist, is this a good step in the right direction? Is it sustainable? We're likely to make money out of it as a country, but also we know there are outliers. If the government is making money, there are other people who are working around the particular companies that are behind these innovations. They will also be making money.
One thing that our viewer must understand, and it's a really very, very big elephant that within the environment and climate space we are grappling with, is the issue of balancing development with environmental conservation. And indeed, when it comes to issues of, for example, revenue collection and revenue generation, I want to show you a classic example of why we are really struggling on the fight against the polythene bags, the Kavera. Contestations have always been that we actually do not want to have, for example, polythene bags of about 30 microns into the environment, because these are non-biodegradable. We as environmentalists, from our end, we've been pushing back, through advocacy, but also strategic engagement. But I can tell you that we're not registering the progress that we want to achieve, because at the end of the day, on the other spectrum, you have government interested in collecting taxes. So in light of what you're talking about, for example, the issue of the vehicles and the taxes that really government wants to collect, it's a very, very big challenge, because on the other end, URA has a threshold of the tax target that it must be able to mobilize, money that must be mobilized. But also on the other end, you actually have the environment, that is being heavily, depleted, because I have been, one of the areas that I've been so much interested in, and I would want probably our dear viewers to also, is the issue of, for example, waste management, where we can actually turn our waste into wealth. I've been seeing many young people that are involved, for example, in waste picking, people who are involved in, in collecting of the waste that we have in the communities. And you've also seen some of the conversations about how we can generate, for example, electricity out of our waste and that. You remember the conversation about doing a time of Chitezi. So for me, I think that the time has come for us as a country to be able to be very clear about what we must focus on. Because yes, at the end of the day, we need, for me, I come from a background where I actually say that we need both. We need to generate our, the revenue. We need to grow our economy. We need to grow our GDP as a country. We must create jobs, especially for our young people. But at the same time, we must be, alive to the fact that we must be able to, conserve and preserve our environment. And indeed, our legal framework, Article 39 of our Constitution, which lays out the right to a clean and healthy environment, was alive to that. That yes, we must, all of us as a people, must enjoy a clean and healthy environment, because it doesn't make sense for us to grow our economy, collect taxes, but when we are actually, severely damaging our environment, we must also be alive to the fact that, when you see the extent to which our environment has really been seriously degraded at the altar of development. I told you, for example, like some of the businesses and the industries and the factories that are being set up in wetlands, time and again, where government comes up with a very full force of the army. So the other day when people in Rubiji were being evicted, as environmental, defenders would say, yeah, that's very good. But then at the end of the day, you find that, only the ordinary people are the ones that are pushed out. But then the people, the big people, the big fish, the industrialists, they're not touched. So we want to see a bit of, because the law is very clear, and people have been talking about the selective, application of the law. Section 5 of our National Environment Act is very clear that every development must ensure that it carries out, environmental impact assessment, that we must always ensure that at all times we observe environmental standards and ensure you have environmental safeguards. So the development that we promote, we should be able to have as a country is what we call sustainable development. And that is the concept of balancing development and environmental conservation. Of course, time and again, we in the environmental space, climate activists who have been called poverty conservationists, but we are actually saying it is possible to have development, but at the same time, when we are also, conserving our environment.
All right. Can you then respond to my question about the industry, the industry in our country, an attempt for us to actually produce vehicles that are driven as a strategy to combat climate change?
Yeah, that conversation has been on, and I think you are even giving a classic example. For example, I think even Cheetah Motors, they're trying to really come up with, electric vehicles,
motorcycles,
and motorcycles. Many motorcycles. Actually, for me, in these days, even I usually prefer to move by, motorcycles. The borders who are really using the batteries. Of course, it's a good step. Like I've told you, the conversation about reduction of emissions reduction needs a multi-pronged approach that, like, for example, we support that intervention. But you see, the challenge is one also, as I talked about, the issue of waste management, that even how these batteries actually dispose it is also very critical.
Another issue.
It's a very critical issue. So, and for me, as someone who has really been so, involved in this, environmental, activism and working closely with colleagues within civil society, I should say that some of our interventions, you find that we make, 2 steps forward and we make 3 steps backwards, because time and again, the challenge is that we don't seem to actually, we don't remain consistent with what we actually want to push for, because at the end of the day, you actually have now people. Yes, it's a good step, but how do we ensure that we actually dispose of these batteries from the environment, because that's so very, very critical. So for me, I think that yes, we should support the transition into electric, but you should also know that, for example, government is a priority, is actually to exploit our oil and gas resource, and therefore you find there's a bit of contradiction that if we are now transitioning towards electric vehicles and electric motorcycles, but then government is strongly focusing on producing, we are supposed to receive our first oil this year. So it's a catch-22. But of course, that is something that we must strike out, and I'm happy that many citizens really, especially The journalists, the fourth estate has been very, very aggressive. When you look at, for example, the innovations that many people in the fourth estate have been coming up with, to try and popularize. Because it starts with creating awareness. A voice like mine may not be enough. I've been really, speaking out, writing, colleagues, especially focusing on young people. But we must see every citizen coming out in large numbers, because Article 17 of the Constitution gives us all a duty to create a clear and healthy environment. Yes, government is a primary duty bearer, but all of us as a people must come out in large numbers to know that we all have a role to play to ensure that we actually have a clean and healthy environment and combat climate change, because it affects all of us.
Mr. Robert Churiachila, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And dear viewer, I hope through this segment of discussion we've been able to learn how climate change is affecting making money, but how we can also make money out of climate change. Mr. Robert Churiachila has talked to us about carbon trade, talked about other things that you can actually take advantage of, including energy transition, to be able to make money, although climate change is considered as a danger to our community. Until next time, thank you so much.